Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled FDA Oncology Center of Excellence Programs and Projects that Impact Drug Development. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout this presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Worldwide Clinical Trials who developed the content for this presentation. Worldwide Clinical Trials is a leading global contract research organization that works in partnership with biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies to create customized solutions that advance new medications from discovery to reality. Their full-service clinical development capabilities include bioanalytical laboratory services and phase 1 through 4 clinical trials, as well as post-approval and real-world evidence studies, all powered by their talented and accessible team of clinicians, scientists, and researchers who bring their first-hand expertise to each clinical program. Their team of 3,000 plus professionals spans over 60 countries and believes that through collaboration and a culture that embraces diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, everyone plays an important role in making a world of difference for patients and their caregivers. They are united in cause with their customers to improve the lives of patients through new innovative therapies. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers for today's webinar. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Matt Cooper, Executive Director of Therapeutic Strategy Lead, Oncology at Worldwide Clinical Trials. And there he is. Hi, Matt. Matt has
Hello.
25 years of experience in the life science industry conducting clinical trials across all phases. His experience spans roles at sponsor sites and NHS, and he has extensive experience in site management and expanded use of oncology therapies. He is passionate about building effective relationships between industry stakeholders to drive innovation and patient access. And next, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Matthew Confeld. He is the Assistant Director, there he is, Clinical Research Methodology at Worldwide Clinical Trials. And Matthew has over 10 years of experience in pharmaceutical science. His experience spans preclinical drug development of environmental responsive nanoparticles for various solid tumor indications, serves as a translational advisor to a National Institute of Health Center of Biologic Research in pancreatic cancer, and has extensive experience in pharmacy, including clinical pharmacogenomics for a large healthcare system and specialty pharmacy management. He provides consulting-like services to sponsors across phases of development from preclinical through NDA. And now, with that done, it's my pleasure to pass the mic over to Matthew. So Matthew, when you're ready, you may begin.
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. Could just move to the next slide here. Thank you. And we just want to start off with a little bit of a brief history. We kind of need to know where we came from to know where we're going. And so I want to provide a little context of some of the major legislative acts that were passed in U.S. oncology history. Next slide, please. And one of the first major ones is really the National Cancer Act of 1937. It provided support for cancer research by creating the National Cancer Institute, which merged the Office of Cancer Investigations at Harvard University with the Pharmacology Division of the National Institute of Health that was available at the time. The National Cancer Institute then became the federal government's primary agency to address research and training needs for the cause, diagnosis, and treatment of cancer. Shortly after that, with the aid of the emerging science of biostatistics, regulators actually began to appreciate and interpret the various nuanced components of trial design and their effect on how data is analyzed. This then spurred funding to create institutional cancer trial networks, with one of the first being the Southwest Oncology Group, which is still active today and consists of more than 4,000 researchers at more than 650 institutions across the United States and Canada. Next, one of the major ones here was the National Cancer Act of 1971, or the War on Cancer as they deemed it, which granted the director of NCI really broad authority to plan, develop an expanded, intensified, and coordinated national cancer program. It provided additional funding, which helped establish 15 new cancer research centers, local cancer control programs, and an international cancer research data bank. And for all you history buffs, there is a detailed 100 years of legislative history related to the National Cancer Institute on their website, but we're not going to go into much more detail on some of the history. Let's focus more on our current discussion today. If you could go to the next slide, please, Sonia. And so here's where our discussion really starts, with the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016 and the Cancer Moonshot Initiative. This act established the Oncology Center of Excellence, which really led to a lot of the projects and programs that we'll be discussing today. The Cancer Moonshot Initiative had a goal of reducing the death rate from cancer by over 50% over the next 25 years, provided significant funding to accelerate scientific discovery in cancer, and foster greater collaboration and improve sharing of cancer data. It created and updated multiple non-clinical and clinical guidance documents, established projects and programs impacting early and late phase development, and conducted outreach and engagement of key stakeholders, including patients, physicians, and pharmaceutical companies, to really calibrate the objectives and the details of the programs and initiatives that they're providing. Can you go to the next slide? And so today, in now 7 years into the Cancer Moonshot Initiative, there's been over 300 different programs, including grants, educational outreach, speaking events. But today, what we really want to focus on are some of the early phase projects, as well as some of the ones impacting late phase development. For early phase, we'll be discussing Project Catalyst, Endpoint, Significant, and Optimus. And then the late phase projects will be Equity, Silver, Orbis, and Pragmatica. And so let's get into it. Sonia, could you start with the next slide? Well, first, I want to get a little bit of background on who's here today. And so we will have a quick poll question looking at your lead program. Where are you in the continuum of discovery and development?
Okay,
Sonia,
and
if you could please start the poll.
Not a problem. I've just launched the poll, so everyone should see it now appear on their screen. Now, if you could go up right ahead right now to go ahead and select one of the below. Is it phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, or are you in multiple phases? So I'll leave this open for another 10 seconds, as it's a simple poll question here. And then we will close the polls as it's done in real time and take a look at the results. And then we'll get right back into this great discussion. Okay, that looks like it's the majority of our audience. We have a few more members out there who have not selected. I'll leave it open now for a little while longer, so you can go ahead and make your selection now. Then I'll close the polls. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for participating in poll question number 1. Now let's take a look at the results. Okay, so here are the results. In our audience, 22% said phase 1, while 13% said phase 2, then another 13% for phase 3. We had 0% of our audience that chose phase 4, and then we had 52% of our audience said multiple phases. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in our first poll. Now, before we get right back into this discussion here, Matthew and Matt, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the results of that poll question. Anything surprising there?
Yeah, Matt, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting to see that it's really in our sort of sweet spot, I guess, and really in the phase 1 setting is where we do a lot of our work, and and then obviously moving into phase 2 and phase 3. But yeah, that's really where our core experience is, in that phase 1 setting. So that's good to see we've got the right target audience there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Matthew, what about yourself?
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting to see how many people are in multiple phases of development. And what we've been seeing a lot are some of these therapies that do lend themselves to multiple potential indications. And so sometimes we'll get that lead indication that's kind of, a little bit farther in development. And then that kind of spurs additional funding to start looking at some other targets in some earlier phases. And I think we're going to have some great discussion that's going to be applicable to really all the attendees today. And so let's get started and move on to our first project here in early phase with Project Catalyst. And so cancer omics is really leading to this increased subtyping of what were once larger cancer types into many smaller subtypes that may have these actionable pathways or mutations. And so these small cancer subtypes really generate less economic incentive, especially for those large commercial pharma. But they're very interesting and motivating diseases for many of our academic scientists. And so this has led to incubators and emerging biopharma companies as really leaders in innovation in oncology treatment. And these small companies or academic spin-offs are now accounting for more than 70% of the development pipeline. The FDA has taken note of this and this changing dynamic, and is providing guidance and educational resources to help support informed anti-cancer development to expedite the availability of innovative and novel cancer treatments to the public. And this includes bench to bedside chat, which so far they have had talks on S9 non-clinical evaluation requirements, expedited development programs, and cancer therapies for ultra-rare indications. They also have a frequently asked questions page that ranges from topics of companion diagnostics to cell and gene therapies. And you can even attempt to ask your own questions to these regulatory experts through a form submission process. And at worldwide clinical trials, over 97% of our customer base are actually small to mid-sized pharma companies. And we often have sponsors asking about these complex development topics. And that's partially why we created our clinical research methodology group to help sponsors answer these difficult questions and really try to merge the science, medicine, and operations, something that a typical regulatory consultant may find a little bit challenging. Moving on to our next project is Project Endpoint. And while it's still technically under development, Project Endpoint aims to enhance the use of early endpoints in oncology drug development. So patients are being treated earlier and with better treatments, leading to long survival times, and in more and more cases, actual cures. However, assessing long-term survival outcomes, which is the gold standard in oncology, can take many years, especially in these early stages of disease. And so even using overall survival isn't a perfect endpoint either. It can be affected by crossover, especially subsequent lines of therapy. It includes non-cancer deaths, and it cannot be accurately assessed in single-arm trials along with other time to event endpoints. We also have progression-free survival and objective response rate as major endpoints that are commonly used, but they have varying degrees of correlation to survival, and it varies significantly between tumor types. So there really is a need for a reliable and standardized earlier endpoint than survival that could really support future approvals. In my opinion, something that I think would be interesting and would like to see is the creation of a multi-domain responder index, or an MDRI. And that's able to accommodate these complex and heterogeneous disease manifestations. And how it works is each domain has a score with a cutoff for what would be considered a minimally important clinical difference. And so now you have this MDRI that could include a disease symptom domain, a quality of life domain, and some form of tumor response as well. And so then I would imagine if I was a patient and the therapy gave me a clinically important improvement in those three domains, now that's a therapy that should be on the market sooner rather than later. So speaking of using therapies sooner, Matt, I understand there is another project from the FDA called Frontrunner. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, sure. So Frontrunner really is looking at how you can start doing more of these earlier trials earlier during the disease in the patient, so earlier stage of disease, and hopefully while patients are going to be fitter and better able to tolerate these new drugs and new treatments. So, the plan would be if you're treating patients in trials earlier in their disease setting where they've not got so many confounding factors involved around sort of disease-related factors, or where the patient's perhaps been through multiple rounds of prior treatment and he's feeling fatigued, sort of mentally and physically. That this new treatments set in an earlier setting have got more potential to hopefully alter the course of their disease more effectively, and this has got to be a better option for patients, particularly I guess in some of those looking at patients with just gone in newly diagnosed with metastatic disease, where better a treatment option either as an add-on or a replacement of a non-curative or perhaps quite a toxic drug is going to be a good way to go forward and try and look at trialing in those earlier populations.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, if the therapy is working really well in these late phase or late line therapies, it really does make sense to try and move that earlier and see if it's having benefit in those earlier lines for patients as well. Next slide, please. Today, biostatistics are actually helping to address some of these new questions emerging from innovative trial designs. This project here has gathered subject matter experts to discuss a number of growing issues in clinical trial methodology. Some of the notable topics include the growing use of master protocols, which combine multiple trials under one protocol, hence the clever name of the design. However, there are potential analytic concerns around making multiple comparisons to a common control arm, as well as some other potential limitations. Matt, what things has your team been seeing in this trend of using master protocols?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing quite a few now of projects coming through, particularly in the platform sort of studies where you've got multiple arms being tested, and in those trial settings, that those studies can almost be sort of semi-perpetual, where you can bring arms in, and as you're getting data through, you can stop arms that aren't looking like they're showing to be very promising, and you can bring your new arms on, or within that same sort of master protocol within the trial. A great example of this is the Stampede study, which was produced by the MRC in the UK, and it's a really long-running study in prostate cancer, where they had multiple arms. And because these different arms are distinct in terms of their data, they actually had different pharma companies providing drug to those different arms. So it's a great way also to have collaboration under one disease setting, as in this case it was prostate cancer. And the other element around this is, because you've got flexibility in those arms that you can bring on or off, you can adapt your trial as the trial's running and standard of care changes as your trial's running. So in the Stampede study, they found that docetaxel arm actually outperformed the standard of care arm, and they changed that to become the new standard of care. And because that had been the same comparison against all the other arms in the trial, they were able to do that within that trial setting relatively simply. And it's been proved to be a great study, and some of the data from that has gone on to support marketing authorizations in the EMA.
Yeah, and our team's seen kind of some similar things too, as these again, as I mentioned previously, these therapies that lend themselves to multiple potential indications really might have a lot of benefit in using these master protocols. And so our team actually just finished up a white paper talking on the different benefits and limitations of master protocols, baskets, and umbrella designs across many indications, not just oncology, but some of the limitations and benefits are the same. Another interesting topic from Project Significant was the use of Bayesian approaches in pediatric trials. One example study that they were discussing was a rare pediatric tumor study that used a 2-to-1 randomization with Bayesian approaches to actually augment the control arm with what's called propensity matched real world data. So essentially, they were able to have additional patients in the trial to make comparisons to without actually having additional patients, if that makes sense. Some additional things here with the inclusion of broader patient populations. This can introduce some heterogeneity, especially if the trial includes more comorbidities or poor prognosis. That would really increase the chances of rejecting an effective therapy. So how do we really manage these underrepresented populations in a clinical trial, but still try to maintain some type of cohesiveness in that study design? And so there really are now increasing more clinical trial designs and statistical methods to include and evaluate the treatment effects in these underrepresented cancer patients, such as those with poor kidney or liver function, patients with brain metastases, and various racial and ethnic groups are now looking for ways of how do we get data for these patients without having to run an entire trial specifically looking at this patient type. So some great developments there, and this will really play into some of our late phase discussion as well with Project Equity and Project Silver as well, and how to incorporate that into your clinical trial program. Move to the next slide here, and Project Optimus. And so this is really one of our probably biggest discussion points that we've had with sponsors in the last couple of years, and for good reason, because it has really changed how we're looking at dose optimization and dose selection in oncology. And so a quick bit of history. So for many years, the use of the maximum tolerated dose was really the primary objective of a lot of these early phase studies. But unfortunately, it led to approval of a lot of intolerable drugs. As you can imagine, we were pushing the doses as high as we could, assuming there was this linear dose response. So more drug meant a better tumor response. But what happened is eventually that these drugs were being approved, and patients weren't really able to tolerate them, especially in more real world conditions. They'd only be able to take it for maybe a few months before requiring to have dose reduction or maybe stop taking the drug completely. And so you don't really get that efficacy benefit if you're not taking the drug as it was tested in the trial or as it was intended. And so Optimus is really intended to reform that dose optimization and dose selection and move it really into that early phase of development. And dose selection is going to be multifaceted. It's going to have efficacy is going to be important, but so is the time it takes to have that response, as well as the duration of that response. Dose limiting toxicities are going to be important, but so is the relative dose intensity as well. So for those who are not familiar with relative dose intensity, that's the amount of administered drug compared to the expected amount. And so, for example, if the patient was supposed to receive 100 milligrams over a dosing period, but they were only able to receive maybe 70 milligrams due to some toxicities they were having, they had a 70% relative dose intensity. And then, of course, long-term safety. We really focus a lot of times with these DLT windows of maybe 28 days or something, but we're seeing, especially with a lot of these immunotherapies, is some of these long-term toxicities that end up showing up a little bit later or much later in some cases. And then the pharmacokinetics and these dose exposure responses. And so on the right side here, I put this little graphic here, just give you kind of an idea of what this ends up looking like. And so what this new requirement that came out, Project Optimus, is that you really have to have this dose justification meeting with the FDA and present kind of your case for why you want to use a specific dose for your pivotal and confirmatory investigations in the future. And so you can see from this little table what that kind of would look like. So you have your very low dose on the left side here, and pharmacodynamics aren't quite what you're looking for. You don't quite inhibit that pathway fully. And you can see that it's having a big impact on the efficacy of that therapy, as there's really not any responses. But obviously the safety is going to be good, and the relative dose intensity from that is good because the dose is fairly low. But then we start moving up to higher doses, and now we're having better inhibition of that pathway. We're starting to see some efficacy outcomes from that. But there may be a little bit more safety issues associated with that, and patients might not be able to take that full dose as often. And then finally, we push the dose up a little bit higher, and now we're seeing really a sustained effect of that pathway inhibition over the entire dosing interval. That's having an impact on the efficacy that we're seeing. But as you can see down here in the bottom, now our safety is really being impacted, and a lot of patients aren't able to handle the dose as intended. And so maybe this, even though the efficacy is better, it might not be the best dose to select. And so we might need to make either some adjustments to how we're giving the drug or the dosage that we're giving to really still try and optimize our therapy from here on. And let's go to the next slide here, Sonia. What we're really seeing a lot of, and a lot of focus has been on, is really just flexibility in our study designs. In today's oncology trials, there's 2 to 3 times as much data as there was just a decade ago. And really knowing what to do with all this data, with the safety data, the treatment-related adverse events, and all the things that are coming out of that can be difficult to analyze a lot of times. Now, there's even artificial intelligence companies that are working with sponsors to help try and take all this data and try and identify various subgroups within their trials that may be responding particularly well. And so there's some interesting developments on really how to use all this data that we're collecting. Thinking about the dose regimen and selection, you want to be able to make some adaptations as you're going along, as you're going through those typical dose escalation steps, and you start seeing some early signs of efficacy. We might not want to completely double the dose from there. Maybe we only want to take a half step up and see if that little increase is going to impact our efficacy. Or if we're having some toxicity issues for maybe a drug that you take every day, we could maybe drop that down to maybe 5 days a week and see how that impacts our efficacy and safety benefit ratio. And as far as the study design, we are really moving away, for the most part, from the traditional 3+3 rules-based design and moving more towards some of the flexible model-assisted and model-based designs that have come up and been approved as being fit for purpose for dose escalation studies by the FDA in 2021. And what's the nice part with some of these model-assisted and model-based designs is they're not stuck on this, we have to have 3-patient cohort type of thing. You can add 1 patient or 2 or 4 or 5 into a cohort that you're really just trying to look for some additional information on. Maybe you saw some early signs of efficacy, but you were escalating your doses, so maybe you're up a little bit higher. And so by using these new designs, it allows for that increased flexibility and better dose finding ability. We also want to focus in these early phase designs on hypothesis generation. That hypothesis confirmation, that's more late phase. That's where we have, the confirmatory phase 3 trial. But in these early phase studies, there's still a lot of potential uncertainties about exactly how this therapy works and how the drug is having its pharmacologic action. And so generating new ideas in these early phases can really lead to some new ideas and some new potential ways to take your therapy as you're developing it. And then finally, really merging that science and medicine with the operational footprint and operational complexity of doing these designs that do require these flexibilities and changes in how we're working. And it does really require often flexibility from the clinical research partner, because we may need to adjust how many patients we're adding, what doses we're looking at, and having experience in doing that really does make a big difference, so there aren't significant delays in your early phase program. Matt, any comments from you on study design elements that you're seeing?
Well, I mean, I guess it's a very technical topic around the design of the studies, and particularly when you start talking about the stats and Bayesian approaches, etc. But I guess at the heart of it is that sort of patient-centric piece around. We want to make sure that we've got the best dose that we're taking through into the trials. We don't want to be bringing medicines to market that don't have the really good optimized dose for patients. Particularly in the immuno-oncology setting, where patients are going to be taking these drugs for quite a long period of time, compared to more traditional sort of chemotherapies, etc., where chronic and low grade toxicities are going to have an impact on them and their lives, and it can lead to patients not taking all the doses, dose reductions, and patients essentially being being undertreated, which at the end of the day could lead to disease progression. I think we need to make sure we've got as good a dose as possible moving forward. I think we've seen in the market, medicines coming to market, then having to do further confirmatory studies to make sure that actually they've got the right doses. Dasatinib came to market as a 70 milligrams twice a day drug, but due to sort of longer term toxicity issues, which were discovered then, post-marketing studies were performed to then say actually 100 milligrams once a day was a much better tolerated dose with lower toxicities for patients. So I think it's a really important piece of work.
Yeah, thank you. And next slide, Sonia. All right, Matt, would you like to take over some of these late phase projects?
Yeah, that'd be super. So the next slide, please, Sonia. That's great. So as Matt was saying, some of the projects were also being produced through the FDA, looking at more into the sort of the later phase setting, and I've put equity and project equity and project silver together as silver's almost could be sort of seen as like a subset of the one. Equity project equity is a public health initiative from the FDA, and it's really trying to ensure that the data that's submitted to the regulator for the approval of oncology products is adequately reflecting the target demographic for which the drugs and the patients are going to be using those products are. And one of the key aims of equity is to make sure that we've got policies that are in place to ensure that there are adequate enrollment of underrepresented and vulnerable subgroups into oncology clinical trials, because the data that we've been using in studies to date really has unequal representation from certain groups such as racial minorities or females, elderly patients, and that's where Project Silver comes into this as well. Rural populations where people could live a very long way away from centres, and patients with comorbidities who can often be excluded from studies due to the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it means that a lot of pivotal oncology trials, I guess you could say, have been conducted with patient pools that don't really represent the real world population that the medicines are going to be used in the first place. And also, I guess, patients aren't receiving the opportunity to take part in trials because of the way that protocols have been written, and whether that's because of unconscious bias when it's been produced, or because of the geographical challenges that the patients are having to get to the places where the studies are being run, or that the design itself is causing issues for certain groups of patients. And when you look at the data that's out there, 80% of trial participants are white. When you look at the data from 2011 to 2017 for the drugs that were approved in that particular period of time, when you look at the patient populations that were a part of those study cohorts. 50% of those patients were European, 30% North American, 13% were Asian, and 2% came from South America. And yeah, that's quite an unbalanced, I guess, world population there within that set of patients. Project Silver itself is looking at increasing the representation of the older patients into trials. And when they say older, they mean 65 plus patients, where the cancer incidence is increasing in those populations quite rapidly compared to other ages. But in the trial setting, there's a big drop off between patients under 65 and those over 65, so they're not really represented in trials very well. And an example of that is multiple myeloma, where the age of patients with multiple myeloma is going to be really increasing rapidly by sort of 2030 compared to those of the younger ages, but then very underrepresented in that trial data set. I mean, I guess the other issues around this in the trial setting is sort of the older populations have got a different disease biology. They might have more comorbidities, certainly. So 80% of 65 plus patients have more than one comorbidity. And there's the polypharmacy question as well, where the older you get, unfortunately, you probably are going to be taking more medicines than most. And it's not an oncology only issue, obviously. It's across all clinical trials. I think when they were looked at cardiovascular studies, I think 40% of patients are over 75 are using cardiovascular drugs, but I think less than 10% of cardiovascular trial patients were aged 75 plus. So when you go back to equity and trying to get a broader range of individuals into trials and getting greater equality and diversity in those studies, the FDA have put through guidance in 2022, and then in 2023 that was actually an act was passed, the Consolidated Authorizations Act, which required drug and device sponsors to have a diversity action plan in place. And these plans have sort of four elements of these diversity plans, with looking at what the disease overview is, the scope of the development of the product, the enrollment goals of the trial, and then what actions are going to be taken to ensure that you're enrolling and retaining the right participants into that. And this came in place in sort of 2022, and when the FDA did a look over the plans that were submitted over the last sort of 12 months or so, they found that the plans were pretty good when it was looking at sort of the community engagement aspects and the patient directed measures to include more patients from a diverse background into studies. But few of the studies or the diversity plans looked at sort of the eligibility criteria and the designs of the study, and this is where the FDA have had to sort of address most of their comments to trialists. So I think that's the areas that need to be looked at. I think when you look at the way we've been approaching this from the worldwide aspect, the plans here that are shown on the slide, looking at what are the diversity goals of the study, really establish what they are, looking at the inclusivity of design, making sure your inclusion and exclusion criteria are good enough but not overly limiting to and excluding certain populations. And the same again when looking at determining the site mixes and whether your centres are going to be set up to really be able to recruit the patient populations you're looking at. They're not just big academic centres in the big cities. And doing more outreach prior to the study starting with the communities that you want to be running the trials in, and that making sure that those materials are going to be sort of culturally appropriate, and that translation is going to be there, because in some areas there's very diverse populations there, and you really want to make sure that you're patient information consent forms are going to be able to be fully understood by the patient populations you want to be working with, and throughout that whole trial journey that the patients are being supported appropriately. I mean, this isn't going to be easy. It's not a simple fix. I guess it's going to need making sure they've got institutional commitment across the board, that the clinical development strategy and enrollment goals are really going to be as appropriately set as possible. And of course, all this brings in the operational strategies that are going to be needed to make these trials possible. I know, Matt, Matthew, you've got more things around the impacts of designing these populations, particularly in sort of the geriatric sort of assessment tools.
Yeah, and so I mean, as a pharmacist, I really love these projects that they're putting out here and this new requirement for diversity, because as Matt said, a lot of our clinical trial population is that white population, but our population as a whole is much more mixed and spread out. And for many that are seen for different cultural groups, different ethnic groups, and especially patients with different comorbidities. But then on requirement to be able to manage the different potential confounders and make sure that these patients are not going to have some negative impact on how the trial is running out. And so what the FDA is looking into to support that is really they're trying to identify some type of geriatric assessment tool and other measures of physiologic age, so that there's some type of standardization, almost like an ECOG performance score for the geriatric population. Some other methods to make it easier for these patients to be included with the COVID pandemic, decentralized clinical trials have been a growing option. And so having the ability to let patients who might have some mobility issues and be able to stay at their homes and kind of bring the clinical trial to them in a sense is another option to make it easier for these patients to be included. There's also options for what are called nested subgroup studies. And so you don't necessarily have to have an entire trial that's dedicated to your geriatric population, but we can create what's called a nested subgroup within a study to have a small population with some key inclusion-exclusion criteria that are slightly different than the overall population, to get a better idea of how these different people are responding. And that is going to eventually clearly impact what drugs we're selecting and what dosages we're selecting to be treating those patients with it, because it might not be the same dosage for all patients.
Great, good stuff. Thanks, Matthew. Sonia, the next slide, please. So the Project Orbis really is a regulatory focused study, and the aim is making sure that we can have a more coordinated approach across countries and their regulators when it comes to the approvals process. And the partners in this project are listed down on the right hand side of the slide there. And the idea is that what you want to try and do is have a quicker pathway to a sort of a global approval of studies, compared to just being approved through regulator by regulator. So what Orbis is doing is the FDA are acting as a sort of a central coordinating hub for the review of new medicines coming through, and there's certain selection criteria around the particular trials that are going to be suitable for this, whether it's a breakthrough product, whether it's a product of overwhelming or unmet need. But essentially, they coordinate the review from the FDA centre, but bring in all of the other country regulators that are taking part in this particular project. And it doesn't need to be every regulator taking part in every single drug approval process. It just depends on the particular products. But essentially, they coordinate virtual meetings of the regulators in a round table. And so far, 60 odd oncology products have come through the process, resulting in 38 new approvals. And they've also shown that the time to approval has been dramatically improved from the FDA alone, just doing its own approvals process is only like about half a month quicker, a couple of weeks quicker than the whole Orbis submission when it involves multiple countries, and that the median time for approval through an Orbis project was around 4.2 months, and this is much quicker than the sort of the 9 months or more when it involves individual agencies approving the drug under their own steam. So yeah, it's a great for patients, because hopefully drugs are going to get through quicker to market. And the areas for expansion obviously is involving more countries than those ones listed on the study, and making perhaps looking at more complex applications such as cell and gene therapies. So it's a big step forward for expediting patient access to new products. And Matthew, you were looking at sort of the trial strategy and sort of the phase 3 and how that would blend in with the Orbis approach as well to regulatory.
Yeah, and well, I haven't been able to verify this exactly. I was told by one of our regulatory personnel that the US FDA has as much staff on their team as the entire European Union combined, and even more so than that. And so I really like the idea that the FDA is kind of taking the responsibility and the charge to lead this approval process to really allow patients all over the world to receive these therapies sooner. And so what we're seeing is you really need to think about this in your early phase 3 planning strategy and operational footprint, because these Orbis partners, they're going to also want to see some patients from their countries included in these trials. So we're going to have to include sites and investigators from those different partners. You're also going to have to think about some of the regulatory aspects of those various countries and what requirements they may have that may be different than what you currently have your approvals for. And so it's something, if you're interested in potentially going down this pathway and allowing for this abbreviated approval system, to talk about it with regulators early on. Your end of phase 2 meeting is really a great time to do it, but any time in that early phase 3 planning is optimal.
Great stuff. So next slide, please, Sonia. So Matthew, Pragmatica, I guess it's a project that sort of touches on several areas that we've discussed today really already. So over to you.
Yeah, and so what Project Pragmatica is really thinking about is that in our current clinical trials and really a lot of these large academic centers, there's so much structure and so many people involved in the care of the patient. You can see on this left side, we've got our oncology coordinator and the patient and family there in the middle, and all these support staff around. But in the real world, it's not quite as structured, and the assessments aren't always on time. And so we're not going to have those assessments for tumor response every 6 or 8 weeks. There might be much more delayed because people have their lives going on and different things happen. And so what this Project Pragmatica is doing is really trying to create broader inclusion-exclusion criteria, more limited patient assessments, to make it easier to not only on patients to be in clinical trials, but also allow some of these more community and rural oncology sites to enroll patients into these studies. And so there's been lots of discussions on exactly how to do this, what's considered a pragmatic trial, what's not. There's been a few methods developing on really how to assess the complexity of your study. Matt, do you want to talk about this tool being looked at?
Yeah, I mean the PRACIS-2 tool is a really quite neat sort of visual representation of how sort of pragmatic your study is. Loudon et al. Designed this from the BMJ article, and it has sort of these 9 domains around the diagram, and a sliding scale of 1 to 5, with 1 sort of being sort of that's very sort of explanatory, very sort of traditional in its setting, and 5 being very pragmatic and more sort of more inclusive in design. And really it gives researchers, when they're discussing their trial design elements in the early stages of development, an idea around to what extent their study has good pragmatic elements and in it. And the outcome of these choices essentially affect the ease of which your trial it can be run, and the ease in which the results in the trial can be applied to sort of a community of users in a broader setting. So a highly sort of conventional explanatory trial, you'd be a much tighter sort of circle within that white circle, and a more pragmatic study would have a broader sort of spider web approach to that, looking at the various elements of where the trial's recruiting, whether it's set, what the flexibility is around its delivery, etc. It's really worth a look at that model to see how your trial really stacks up against that sort of pragmatic setting.
Yeah, I think where a lot of this use is going to be is really actually for drugs that have already been approved. So we really already know a lot of the safety and efficacy data of those therapies. But what we want to do now is answer maybe some new questions with that therapy, maybe some alternative dosing regimens for therapies that maybe had been approved before Project Optimus occurred, or just like with that Project Equity and Silver, maybe we want to take a look at some of these other diverse patient populations in kind of an easier to enroll opportunity.
Great stuff. Next slide, please.
This one here is the poll. If Sonia, you could get this started.
Okay, I'll jump in right now.
Thank
Do
you.
you want to ask the question there, Matthew?
Yeah, certainly. So which project do you see having the greatest impact on your program? Optimus and the new paradigm and dose optimization, Equity and Silver with their diversity requirements for the patient population, Orbis having the streamlined global drug approval, or Pragmatica being able to integrate real-world practice in clinical trial design?
Okay, there's your options, everyone. So please go ahead right now and cast your vote. Your participation is strongly encouraged and very much appreciated. And it looks like we got half our members already casting their votes. So thank you very much for that. And I'll leave it open for a few more seconds just so we can get everyone's involvement in our last poll question for this webinar. Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in poll question number 2. Now I'm going to close the polls and let's take a look at the results. Okay, so here are the results. Oh, wow. 57% are Optimus, 21% saying Equity Silver, 7% saying Orbis, and 14% saying Pragmatica. So thank you, everyone, for participating in poll question number 2. And briefly, gentlemen, what are your thoughts on the results there? Any surprise with that 57% in Optimus?
I mean, Optimus is where we get a lot of the questions and the discussions with the sponsors that we're working with, most definitely. And I guess maybe we've got a few regulatory folk on the discussion today.
Okay, I'll go to the next slide. Matthew, your thoughts before we go to the next slide?
No, those results pretty much match exactly kind of the rate that we're getting these questions from other sponsors. Optimus has really been kind of that number one. Yeah. But then as we move towards a little bit later phase, Equity and Silver and these diversity action plans have been a big topic as well.
All right, and there you go.
And here, just want to put in a little bit of information about our clinical research methodology team, where we provide strategic, scientific, medical, and operational support. One of our services here that we offer is portfolio evaluation. So when you do have that therapy that might be useful in multiple indications, we'll take a deep dive into those individual indications, looking at different regulatory environment, competitive landscape, your available runway for how long you have to run a trial, and different payer perspectives. We can then take one of those indications selected and do a full clinical development plan, doing a systematic review of all the domains and studies that you'll need from IND all the way through NDA, giving you a high-level ballpark cost estimate for all those studies that you need along the way. We also do some various kind of ad hoc consultation and support for different fast track, breakthrough, orphan drug designations. We do a lot of synopsis and protocol development and support. Pre-IND is probably one of my favorite things to support sponsors with. I feel like we can really have a lot of impact in helping them ask important questions for their design and clinical development program. And then we have some additional IND support activities as well. Next slide, Sonia. And so we'd like to thank you for listening to our talk today, and we'd just like to open up for a few questions here before we end things out.
Okay, and before we start that, I just want to say thank you very much, Matt and Matthew, for that very engaging presentation and discussion. Hope everyone enjoyed it. Let's jump in here now for the roundup for the our last session here of the Q&A. So remember, you can send in your questions right now by using that questions window located on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try to attend to your questions. And if we don't, rest assured the team will follow up with you after this presentation. So let's go to our first question here. This audience member is asking, the FDA wants us to move away from single-arm trials, but accelerated approval to date has mostly been based on single-arm trials. How do they plan to make this change in practice? Who would like to tackle that one first? Matthew or Matt?
Matt, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what we're seeing now is the easiest way that this change can happen in practice is through the FDA guidance as they're going in for discussions with the FDA prior to launching studies. And I think some of the wording that's coming back is the FDA are strongly encouraging sponsors to look at taking two doses through into their next round of studies. And I think when the FDA strongly encourages, then that's usually quite a good inducement to make that change.
Yeah,
anything
and
on your side?
Yeah, I'd like to. And what we're seeing is really, even if the costs are prohibitive or the time is prohibitive, it's not really being an excuse to do a single arm trial. There's really now a huge focus on randomized clinical trials, the understanding that the results from those are just so much better and interpretable than a single arm trial where you don't have that control arm. And so as we're moving forward, I think we're going to start seeing less and less single arm trials only being used in very small, rare indications, or maybe in some other certain situations where randomized controlled trial wouldn't be possible.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. All right, I'm going to squeeze one more question in here before we close out. This question is a little lengthy here. They're asking, how is your practical experience with the project's implementation in phase 1 studies? Specifically, do we need to optimize the dose for each indication, cancer subtype, for the same compound, or can you use the same dose?
Yeah, that's a really a great question, and it's a little bit of both actually. And so typically what many sponsors are doing is the dose escalation is done as kind of an all-comers type of study, looking at multiple different solid tumor types, really just trying to get some early information on the safety of the product. And then once you get to a dose where it is potentially efficacious, that's where we start expanding out into typically individual tumor indications. And so there is kind of this requirement for a dose optimized in individual indications, but there is an allowance for borrowing some data from the indications that you already have done, or some of the other tumor types, to get the safety information and the efficacy information and kind of combine that. And like I had showed in that Project Optimist table, you're really trying to present that to the FDA and make a case why this dose has been optimized, why we think a higher dose would not be better or a lower dose would not be better. And that's really the key there, is making that case to the agency during that dose optimization meeting.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, that's it. Thank you very much for answering all those questions, Matt and Matthew. We've reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar. And if we could not attend to your questions, the team at Worldwide Clinical Trials will follow up with you after this presentation. And if you have any further questions, please go ahead and utilize the email addresses that you see there on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Additionally, there is a link to view the recording of this event, which you can also share with your colleagues so they may register for the recording here as well. Now, before we close out, I just want to say get even more out of today's presentation by downloading the supporting materials that we have available for you. And there's two under the Handouts tab, Key Study Design and Outcomes Projects from the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. And the second handout is Key Inclusivity and Accessibility Projects from the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. So I encourage you to do that. Now it is my pleasure to thank our speakers, Matthew and Matt, for that very insightful presentation. So thank you very much, gentlemen. We
Cheers.
hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at X-Talks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now. Bye everyone. Bye Matt. Bye Matthew.
Bye. Bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye.